The year was 1847, and Illinois was still young, raw, and unsettled. The frontier towns along the rivers and farmland seemed ordinary on the surface, farmers tilling their soil, blacksmiths hammering at the anvil, families gathering in wooden chapels to pray. Yet beneath this image of honest labor and faith, a shadow took root. It was a shadow born not from the wilderness itself, but from the human mind's hunger for certainty, for salvation, and for promises that reached beyond the grave. In the town of Nauvoo, only a few years earlier, people had seen firsthand how faith could gather thousands, how it could raise temples from the soil and inspire migrations across deserts. Religious movements were everywhere, sprouting like weeds in the rich and troubled soil of the American Midwest. This was the era of revival tents and charismatic preachers, of visions, revelations, and voices said to come from heaven. To many settlers, the land seemed soaked with divine possibility, as if God himself had planted them there to begin again. But to others, it was fertile ground for something far darker. It was in this world that a man appeared. A man who carried himself with the calm of a prophet but spoke with the quiet intensity of someone who believed he had been chosen. His name was almost lost to history, erased from official records, whispered only in fragments. He was not the kind of leader who thundered from pulpits, nor the kind who rallied armies. Instead, he spoke softly, carefully, his words falling like drops of water into a parched throat. He told his listeners that death was a lie. He told them the grave was nothing more than a door that could be locked and that he alone carried the key. People were tired of loss. Children died young. Epidemics swept through villages without warning. Women sometimes did not survive childbirth. The soil was rich but unforgiving, and the frontier life seemed built on the edge of constant grief. When this man appeared and told them that mortality could be cheated, that bones would not have to rot in the earth, that the cold silence of death could be denied, they listened. And soon they followed. The first gatherings were small. A handful of families met in barns lit by lanterns, their faces half hidden in shadow as they leaned closer to hear his promises. He did not rage about fire and brimstone as so many preachers did. Instead, he spoke of peace, of eternal life, not in some distant heaven, but here, among them. All they had to do was believe. All they had to do was give themselves fully. What began as whispers spread quickly. The promise of immortality was too powerful, too seductive. By the spring of 1847, in a clearing not far from the Illinois River, a community had taken shape. Families sold their belongings and moved closer to him. They built crude shelters, then cabins, until the settlement looked less like a gathering of believers and more like a hidden village devoted to a secret cause. At night, strange chants were heard, low and rhythmic, carrying across the dark fields. Some claimed they saw bonfires burning late into the morning hours, with figures swaying around them. Children repeated words that did not come from the Bible. Farmers traveling nearby began to avoid the area altogether. Rumors spread that livestock went missing, that graves were disturbed, that the man demanded offerings far stranger than coin. Those who dared to look closer reported unsettling details. The leader rarely ate. His skin was pale, his eyes sharp, unblinking. Some swore he had not aged a day since they first met him. He walked among his followers with the stillness of someone already beyond the world of flesh. When a child fell ill and recovered after he laid hands upon them, the community's faith deepened. When an old woman claimed to have seen her dead husband standing in the trees after one of his ceremonies, the community no longer needed convincing. To them, immortality was real, but outside the clearing, suspicion grew. Local authorities received complaints. Pastors warned their congregations against the heresy of the man who denied death. Still, the cult grew bolder. They stopped attending Sunday services in town. They buried their dead differently, secretly, whispering that they were not burying at all but planting, waiting for a resurrection only they understood. No one knew exactly what was happening in the depths of that settlement. Some believed it was harmless, just another strange frontier sect, destined to vanish as quickly as it appeared. Others whispered of rituals darker than anything the churches could imagine. And then came the disappearances, first a traveler, then a farmhand, then a young woman whose family lived near the cult's land. None were seen again. By the time the authorities moved in, it was already too late. What they found, or what little they admitted to finding, was enough to shatter even hardened men. Cabins abandoned, symbols carved into wood, journals filled with frantic handwriting that spoke of eternity, sacrifice, and the hunger for life without end. And in the center of it all, an altar of rough stone, stained by something the rain had not washed away. The cult leader himself was gone, vanished. Some said he fled into the woods, others that he ascended as he promised, leaving behind only echoes of his voice. No grave was ever found, no body ever recovered. Just stories that still linger like smoke over the prairie. Stories that suggest that perhaps in 1847, in a corner of Illinois, someone dared to offer a bargain no human being should ever accept. A promise of immortality, bought at a price too terrible to name. To understand why a man in 1847 Illinois could gather followers by promising immortality, we must step back into the soil of the time. America in the mid-19th century was a nation split between hope and hardship, caught between the promise of endless land and the reality of endless struggle. Illinois, barely 3 decades into statehood, was still considered frontier. Its towns were raw clusters of wooden buildings, its farms carved out by sweat, axe, and plow. The prairie stretched wide, sometimes beautiful, sometimes merciless, and the people who lived there knew that survival was never guaranteed. This was a world without antibiotics, without modern medicine. Cholera could sweep through a town and erase half its families within weeks. Tuberculosis was common. Malaria, too, lingered in swampy regions. For many settlers, life expectancy was brutally short. Children died before their first birthday with alarming frequency. Mothers often perished in childbirth. Farmers could be crushed by falling trees or maimed by farm equipment with no hospital nearby to save them. Death was not an abstract concept. It was a daily neighbor. Coffins were built quickly, often at home, and funerals were brief, more necessity than ceremony. Against this backdrop, religion became a lifeline. The Midwest was swept up in what historians call the Second Great Awakening, a vast wave of revivalist energy that spread across the young nation. Itinerant preachers traveled from town to town, setting up tents or open-air gatherings. Thousands flocked to hear sermons that promised salvation, spiritual rebirth, and a sense of belonging in a harsh and unpredictable world. The Bible was both compass and comfort, and people clung to it not only for their souls but for their sanity. Illinois was a fertile ground for these movements, partly because it was unsettled and socially fluid. People migrating from the East Coast, from Europe, even from the South, brought different beliefs and traditions. In places like Nauvoo, whole communities were shaped by faith experiments. The Mormons, for instance, built a thriving city there before being driven out in violence. Spiritualism, the belief that the living could communicate with the dead, was just beginning to take root, and seances were becoming popular in parlors. Mesmerism, phrenology, and pseudosciences promising hidden truths attracted crowds. To be alive in Illinois in 1847 was to live at the crossroads of traditional Christianity and a blossoming world of alternative faiths and experiments of the mind. The cult leader who promised immortality stepped into this cultural landscape with precision. He knew the wounds people carried. In a world where a fever could take a child in days, the idea of escaping death was not just appealing, it was intoxicating. Immortality was not offered as some distant afterlife in the clouds, but as something tangible, immediate, and within reach. This distinction made his message powerful. It was not about dying and hoping for heaven. It was about never having to die at all. Social conditions fed this hunger. The economic climate in Illinois was unstable. Farming was exhausting, and prices of crops fluctuated wildly with markets hundreds of miles away. Railroads were only just beginning to creep westward. Most people lived in isolation, with neighbors far apart and little access to institutions of support. Community bonds were fragile, and when someone arrived with charisma, a strong voice, and a message that seemed to lift the burden of mortality, people listened. Culturally, Americans of that era were fascinated by the supernatural. Newspapers reported ghost sightings, miracles, and strange phenomena with little skepticism. Folklore thrived. Families passed down stories of omens, curses, and warnings. On dark nights, when oil lamps flickered in log cabins, the imagination worked as powerfully as any preacher. The cult leader drew from this cultural reservoir, weaving together fragments of scripture with whispers of occult tradition. He told them that he was more than a man, he was a vessel, a chosen guide who had glimpsed eternity and returned to share it. Scientifically, the 19th century was a period of transition. Some men of learning were pushing the boundaries of anatomy and chemistry, but much of what passed as medicine was closer to superstition. Bleeding, purging, and herbal tonics were still common prescriptions. Doctors debated the causes of disease without clear understanding of germs or viruses. In such an environment, claims of miraculous healing could thrive unchecked. If someone claimed they could ward off illness, if someone touched the sick and they improved, who could disprove it? The line between science and mysticism was porous, and the cult leader exploited this uncertainty with chilling effectiveness. Illinois itself was a place of tension between tradition and experiment. In towns, Protestant ministers railed against heresy and tried to hold their congregations steady, but out on the edges of settlement, there were no such safeguards. People were free to believe what they wished. Authority was distant, lawmen stretched thin. A group could vanish into the woods and establish its own rules without much interference. By the time anyone noticed, the rules might already have turned into rituals, and the rituals into something much darker. We must also consider the psychology of the people who followed him. These were men and women who had already left homes, families, and even countries behind in search of a better life on the frontier. They were accustomed to risk, to change, to uprooting everything for the chance at something greater. Following a new faith, even one that defied logic, may not have felt so different from starting a farm on unbroken land. Both required faith. Both required surrender to the unknown. When the cult leader promised that surrendering would not just give them survival but eternity, the cost may not have seemed so high. The cultural memory of previous movements fed into this as well. In the wake of charismatic figures like Joseph Smith, Americans had seen prophets rise and fall, some with violence, some with quiet dispersal. The line between prophet and charlatan was thin and sometimes invisible. But for ordinary settlers, who could not know the future, the risk of believing was weighed against the certainty of suffering. And for those who had buried too many loved ones, the scales tilted toward belief. It is no coincidence that the cult leader's following grew in 1847, a year marked by hardship across the Midwest. Harsh winters, crop failures, and outbreaks of disease made mortality an almost constant conversation. Farmers watched their cattle die of illnesses they could not name. Mothers buried infants before they learned to walk. Husbands were lost to infections from minor injuries. In this atmosphere, the idea of a life without death was not simply religious, it was revolutionary. It cut at the very root of human despair. The leader's promises resonated because they addressed both the body and the soul. To the weary, he promised rest. To the sick, he promised health. To the grieving, he promised reunion. And to all, he promised an unbroken thread of existence that would carry them past the grave into a world that never ended. His settlement in Illinois did not exist in a vacuum. It was the product of a society that was already fragile, already haunted by death, and already searching desperately for meaning. Thus, the stage was set. A land of uncertainty, a people primed by grief, a culture open to visions and mysteries. Into this stage walked one man, armed not with weapons or wealth, but with words, a man who dared to challenge the oldest truth of humanity, and who convinced others to stake everything on his promise. That promise would become their salvation, their curse, and in time, their undoing. The settlement began quietly enough, a cluster of cabins hidden by trees and distance. But what unfolded there in 1847 would leave scars far beyond the Illinois prairie. The first incident came one spring night, when a storm rolled across the fields. Families gathered in the main cabin, the leader at the center, his voice calm despite the thunder. He told them the storm was a test, that lightning itself was a mark of the heavens acknowledging his power. When a bolt struck a tree just beyond the clearing and split it in two, the congregation gasped. To them it was a sign, proof that nature bent to him. Yet one boy standing too close was thrown to the ground by the shock. His body twitched, smoke rising from his hair. The boy's mother screamed, but the leader raised his hands and declared the child chosen, reborn through fire. Hours later, the boy awoke, dazed and burned but alive. The community called it a miracle. Outsiders would have called it an accident, but in that moment, faith tightened its grip. Weeks later, another incident followed. A farmhand who had joined the group was found collapsed in the fields, feverish and delirious. Disease spread quickly in the Midwest, and neighbors would have expected his death. But the leader demanded he be brought to the cabin. There in the glow of lanterns, He placed his hands on the man's chest and murmured strange words, half prayer, half chant. Witnesses swore the fever broke within the hour. The man rose weak but alive. That night, he claimed he had seen figures standing around his bed, figures not of this world. Some thought they were angels. Others whispered they were something else. Either way, the story spread and more came to believe, but not every incident was so easily framed as healing. One autumn evening, a family brought their daughter, stricken with convulsions, to the leader. She thrashed and bit her own tongue, blood dripping from her mouth. The parents begged for mercy. The leader ordered silence, then commanded the men to hold her down. With a blade, he cut into her arm, letting blood flow into a bowl. He claimed the sickness was a poison that had to leave the body, and that her blood carried death itself. The girl screamed until her voice broke. By morning, she was still, her skin cold. The leader declared she had been taken into eternity, her soul freed from decay. He insisted her body not be buried but placed beneath the altar stone, where she would rise again. Her parents, trembling, obeyed. To the community, it was a sacrifice, proof that the path to immortality demanded suffering. To any outsider, it was something far darker. Rumors spread among nearby farms of chanting at night, of fires burning in patterns that resembled symbols. A traveler reported seeing figures walking barefoot across hot coals, their feet unburned. Another claimed to hear cries in the distance like animals, though no livestock were kept within the settlement. By winter, families began vanishing into the cult's orbit, abandoning homes and fields. Their relatives, left behind, spoke with bitterness and fear. Letters sent into the settlement were never answered. When one brother tried to retrieve his sister, he returned pale and silent, refusing to speak of what he had seen. Only once in drink did he mutter about knives, about chanting, about shadows that moved against the light. One of the most chilling incidents came during a burial. A child had died suddenly of fever. Normally, grief would have weighed heavy on the family, but the leader forbade mourning. Instead, he declared the child would not be buried in the churchyard, but beneath the open sky. At night, the congregation carried the small coffin into the woods. There, the box was opened. Witnesses swore the leader leaned over the still face and whispered for nearly an hour. Some claimed the child's chest moved. Others swore they heard a sigh escape the lips. Whether real or imagined, the congregation believed the child's body was not returned to the earth. It was hidden, its location known only to the leader and his closest followers. From that day on, children in the camp were told that death was only sleeping and that the leader alone held the power to awaken them. The winter of 1847 was harsh. Food ran low, livestock weakened, tempers flared. Yet the leader kept control through fear and awe. He told them their suffering was proof they were being tested, that the promise of eternity demanded they shed their old lives completely. When one man questioned him, openly doubting the rituals, the community gathered in the cabin to hear the leader's response. In silence, the man was brought forward. The leader lifted a heavy axe not to strike, but to hold above the man's head. He declared that those who denied the path would meet death immediately. The room froze. Then, with a slow smile, he lowered the blade and declared the man forgiven. The fear of that night bound the group even tighter. No one spoke against him again. Another incident came with blood. During one ritual, the leader demanded that each member cut their palm and let their blood drip into a shared bowl. The act was framed as binding them together, sealing their eternity. But for some, the cuts festered. Infection set in. One woman's hand swelled until it turned black. The leader refused medicine, insisting the sickness was the last of her mortal weakness leaving her. Days later, she died. The congregation gathered, expecting her to rise. When she did not, the leader announced that her time of return was not yet, but that her body would be preserved beneath the altar. Once again, obedience outweighed grief. By spring, the settlement had grown silent to outsiders. Farmers traveling near avoided it. Letters stopped altogether. What little news escaped came from whispers, strange fires, mutilated livestock, missing travelers. Then came the most terrifying event. A young woman from a nearby village disappeared. Her family suspected the cult and demanded she be returned. Days later, she stumbled back into town, barefoot, her dress torn. She could barely speak, but she muttered of knives, of chanting, of being promised eternity if she gave herself fully. Her family hid her away, and she never spoke publicly again. But the damage was done. The rumors now had a face, and the fear spread like wildfire. Inside the settlement, Discipline hardened. The leader grew more demanding, more distant, his eyes said to glow in firelight. Followers reported seeing him walk barefoot through snow without leaving prints. Others swore he no longer ate at all, that he survived on something unseen. When questioned, he said he fed on faith itself, and that soon they too would no longer hunger, no longer thirst, no longer die. His promises of immortality grew more intense, but so did the rituals. By summer, disappearances became more frequent, both from within and outside the settlement. Families who once laughed and sang were now silent, their windows dark, their doors locked tight. The final known incident came when authorities finally attempted to investigate. Reports of missing persons could no longer be ignored. A sheriff and a small group of men rode into the woods. They found cabins abandoned, meals half-eaten on tables, journals left open on desks. Words scrawled across pages spoke of eternity, of blood, of sacrifice. And in the center of the clearing stood the altar stone, darkly stained, surrounded by symbols carved deep into the earth. But of the leader and his followers there was no sign. Not a single body, not a single living soul. Only silence broken by the wind across the prairie. The men returned shaken, some refusing to speak of what they had seen. Rumors suggested they found bones, others that they found nothing at all. Whatever truth lay in that clearing, it was swallowed by time. The cult leader, who had promised to break death itself, vanished into history, leaving behind only fear, whispers, and a mystery that has never been resolved. When news of the cult began to seep into the towns and farms of Illinois, the first reaction was disbelief. Neighbors spoke of odd behavior, of families who stopped attending Sunday services, of children repeating phrases that were not in Scripture. At first, these stories were dismissed as gossip, the kind that thrived in small communities. But as more and more households vanished into the settlement, the whispers grew louder. Families left behind began to ask questions, their worry sharpened by silence. Letters sent into the woods were unanswered, and attempts to visit were met with hostility. Soon, disbelief gave way to fear. Families grieved even while their relatives still lived. A mother in Beardstown wept for her son who had left the farm to follow the leader. She insisted he had been a good boy, hardworking, respectful, until he heard the sermons. Now he would not answer her letters. She said it was as though he had died, though his body still walked the earth. Many shared her sentiment, that the cult had stolen not only loved ones, but their very souls. In taverns and churchyards, people spoke of the leader as a thief of families, a predator who preyed on grief and weakness. The clergy reacted with alarm. Local pastors thundered from their pulpits, denouncing the man as a false prophet, a heretic, a servant of darkness. They compared him to biblical deceivers, wolves in sheep's clothing. Yet their words seemed powerless. For some, the condemnation only proved the leader's authenticity after all. Was it not written that true prophets would be persecuted? The more the churches attacked him, the more tightly his followers clung to his promises. Ministers watched with despair as pews emptied, as congregations fractured, as the authority of the church was challenged by a man who promised not heaven, but eternity on earth. Doctors too found themselves drawn into the debate. In a time when medicine was as much trial as science, reports of miraculous healings stirred unease. Some physicians attempted to explain what had happened: the fever that broke on its own, the recovery of a child that may have been coincidence, the strange survival of injuries that seemed worse than they were. But without the tools of modern science, their explanations sounded hollow. When faced with stories of the dead returning to life or of the leader himself appearing ageless, they had little to offer beyond skepticism. And skepticism, in the face of grief and longing, was a weak defense. The press played its part. Small newspapers in Illinois thrived on sensational stories, and the cult quickly became a favorite subject. Articles spoke of the immortal sect, of the prophet of the woods. Some painted him as a dangerous lunatic, others as a curiosity, a strange sideshow in the wilderness. But as reports of disappearances grew, the tone shifted. Headlines warned of abductions, of blood rituals, of unspeakable ceremonies. Yet details remained vague, and each report contradicted the last. Readers could not be sure what was real and what was rumor, and in that uncertainty, fear flourished. Neighbors living closest to the settlement reported the most disturbing events. Farmers claimed to see bonfires burning past dawn, to hear chants that carried through the trees, to find their livestock missing or mutilated. One woman swore she saw her dead husband standing on the edge of the woods, watching her silently before vanishing. Whether dream or reality, such visions spread quickly. The settlement became a place avoided at all costs, a patch of land marked in conversation only with lowered voices and uneasy glances. Parents warned children not to wander near. Travelers gave it wide berth. The land itself seemed tainted by rumor. Authorities faced a dilemma. Law in mid-19th century Illinois was fragile. Sheriffs had limited manpower, courts were distant, and evidence was scarce. A community choosing to follow its own leader, even in strange ways, was not easily challenged. Freedom of religion was a principle held tightly in the young nation, and unless clear crimes could be proven, officials were hesitant to act. Yet disappearances pushed them toward intervention. When families demanded action, the sheriff finally rode out with men to investigate. What they saw unsettled them deeply, but whether out of fear, confusion, or complicity, they gave little public explanation. Their silence only deepened the mystery, leaving locals to imagine horrors far worse than anything the truth might have held. Psychologically, the cult's rise exposed deep fractures in society. People were not merely angry at the leader. They were angry at themselves, at their neighbors, at the fragility of their world. How could men and women of sound mind abandon their families for promises that defied reason? How could grief make them so vulnerable? These questions stung because the answer was too close to home. Everyone had buried someone. Everyone had felt the hand of death. And everyone in secret longed for a way out. The cult was not just a story about others, it was a mirror held up to their own fears. As months turned into years, the memory of the cult refused to fade. Even after the settlement was found abandoned, with only symbols and journals left behind, people still spoke of it. Farmers claimed the ground remained cursed, that crops would not grow there. Travelers avoided it long after the cabins rotted. Pastors used the story as a warning in sermons, urging congregations to resist false prophets. Newspapers kept the tale alive, embellishing it with each retelling. And in families where loved ones never returned, the wound never healed. For them, there was no closure, only silence. In time, scholars and historians attempted to explain the phenomenon. Some saw it as part of the wider wave of cults and new religions that swept America during the Second Great Awakening. Others framed it as a product of grief in a society plagued by death. Psychologists in later decades would suggest mass hysteria, or the power of suggestion amplified by isolation. Yet none of these explanations satisfied those who had lived near the settlement. They insisted the cult leader was something more, something darker, something that defied mere psychology. Even today, the reactions of the 19th century echo with unease. The story of the cult is not just about a vanished leader or an abandoned village, it is about the fear that even ordinary men and women can be seduced by promises that defy reason. It is about the helplessness of families watching loved ones slip away, alive but unreachable. It is about the failure of churches, doctors, and lawmen to provide answers in a time of desperation. And above all, it is about the silence that remains when an entire community disappears into the woods and never comes back. The end began with whispers, as it always had. In the final weeks of 1847, travelers passing near the settlement spoke of a gathering unlike any before. Fires burned brighter, voices carried further, and strange lights flickered among the trees long after midnight. It was said the cult leader had declared the time had come, the veil between life and death would be torn away, and those faithful enough would never die. He promised them ascension not into heaven but into eternity itself. No more waiting. No more trials. The hour had come. On the appointed night, the followers gathered. The air was cold, the prairie dusted with frost. The moon was full, casting silver light over the clearing. Families stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale in the glow of fire, eyes fixed on the leader who rose before them. He wore no cloak, no crown, only a simple dark coat, but the way he carried himself made him seem taller than any man. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost tender. He spoke of promises fulfilled, of death's defeat, of eternity within their grasp. He told them they had been chosen not by chance, but by destiny. And then he raised his hands, and the ritual began. The congregation sang, not hymns, but low droning chants that pulsed like a heartbeat. The leader moved among them, touching foreheads, whispering words that none but the touched could hear. Some wept openly, others swayed as though entranced. The fires flared higher, sparks spiraling into the night. From the shadows came the sound of drums, though no one could see who struck them. The air thickened, heavy, suffocating, as though the clearing itself held its breath. Then came the knives. Each follower had been told to bring one, simple and sharp. At the leader's command, they drew them, holding the blades aloft in the firelight. He instructed them to cut their palms, to mingle their blood upon the altar stone. The ground was slick with frost, and the dark stains spread quickly, glistening in the light. Children watched, silent, as their parents bled for the promise of eternity. Not a cry was raised, not a voice of dissent. All obeyed. The leader climbed atop the altar, his eyes reflecting the flames. He spoke of sacrifice, of the shedding of mortal weakness. He declared that the final offering was at hand, that to step fully into immortality, they must let go of the last ties to flesh. At his signal, 2 men dragged forward a woman, bound at the wrists. She was not one of them, but an outsider, a traveler taken weeks earlier. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth gagged. The congregation watched as she was forced to her knees. The leader raised his knife, glinting in the firelight. He spoke of the door that would open, of the blood that would unlock eternity. And then, in a motion swift and practiced, he cut her throat. The fire roared as her blood spilled across the stone. The crowd gasped, then cried out, not in horror but in awe. They believed the gate had opened. Some claimed to see figures in the flames, shapes shifting, reaching out. Others fell to their knees, trembling, convinced they felt eternity coursing through their veins. The drums grew louder, the chants faster, the frenzy building until the clearing shook with sound. But beneath it all, beneath the voices and the fire and the blood, there was silence. A silence that pressed against the mind, colder than the frost, darker than the night. A silence that seemed to wait, and then, one by one, the followers began to fall. Some collapsed to the ground, their bodies convulsing. Others stood rigid, eyes rolled back, mouths open in soundless cries. Children screamed for parents who no longer moved. The leader watched from atop the stone, his expression unreadable. Some said he smiled, others said he wept. But all agreed he raised his arms as though in triumph, as though he had called death itself and conquered it. The frenzy broke into chaos. Fire spread to cabins, sparks catching dry wood. Smoke choked the air. Men and women stumbled blindly, bloodied hands reaching for salvation that never came. Some threw themselves onto the altar, desperate to join the sacrifice. Others fled into the woods, their screams echoing into the night. The leader's voice rose above it all, steady and calm, declaring that the passage had begun, that eternity was now theirs. His words were the last many would ever hear. When dawn broke, the clearing was a ruin. The fires had burned down to ash, the cabins smoldering husks. Blood stained the altar, dark and dried. Bodies lay scattered, some lifeless, others vanished without trace. The woman who had been sacrificed was gone, her remains unaccounted for. And the leader himself, he was nowhere. Some claimed he had ascended in fire and smoke. Others believed he fled into the woods. No trail was ever found. The men who entered later, sent by alarmed families and fearful authorities, described a scene that haunted them to their graves. They spoke of symbols carved into the earth, deep and deliberate, radiating from the altar like spokes of a wheel. They found journals filled with frantic writing, words repeated again and again: eternity, blood, ascension. They found children's toys beside cold bodies, food half prepared as if abandoned in haste. But they did not find the leader, and they did not find all of the followers. Some had simply disappeared, as though the earth had swallowed them whole. The climax of the cult was not a triumph, but a collapse, a frenzy of blood and fire that consumed itself in a single night. Yet for those who lived near, for those who lost family, for those who dared to enter the clearing after, it was not an ending. It was a question left unanswered, a mystery unresolved. Did the leader deliver what he promised, or did he only lead them into death, leaving their souls as lost as their bodies? No one could say. The only certainty was the silence that followed, a silence that lingered over the prairie for years, heavy and unbroken. Even now, the climax resists explanation. Was it madness? Mass hysteria? A calculated manipulation that spiraled out of control? Or was it something else? Something darker? Something that defied the rational mind? Those who stood in the clearing at dawn never forgot what they saw, never spoke of it freely, and never walked near that land again. To them, the cult's end was not merely a story. It was a wound, a shadow that stretched across their lives, whispering that the promise of immortality can demand a price far greater than anyone is willing to pay. In the years that followed, the story of the Illinois cult became less a record of fact and more a tapestry of whispers. Newspapers published fragments, cautious in their wording. Some framed it as a cautionary tale of fanaticism, others as a bizarre tragedy on the frontier. But in private, among neighbors and descendants of those who lived near the settlement, the details carried a sharper edge. They spoke not just of what had happened, but of what might still linger. Families who lost loved ones never received closure. No graves were marked, no funerals held. The bodies that had been found were buried quietly, without ceremony, as though the earth itself demanded silence. Yet for every body accounted for, there were others that simply vanished. Mothers clutched lockets of children who had never been seen again. Husbands searched the woods for wives who had followed the cult, finding only torn scraps of clothing or abandoned belongings. Some claimed to hear voices in the night calling their names, voices that sounded painfully familiar. Doctors and scholars tried to explain the events with the tools of their age. They spoke of mass hysteria, of the power of suggestion, of illnesses of the mind that could spread like contagion. They argued that the cult leader had preyed on grief, on fear, on the relentless shadow of death that haunted every frontier family. In a time when medicine was fragile, when epidemics could erase entire households, the promise of immortality was not just seductive, it was irresistible. The tragedy, they claimed, was not supernatural, but human, yet others were not so certain. Pastors warned that the clearing remained cursed, a place tainted by the spilling of innocent blood. Farmers avoided the land, and even hunters kept their distance. When trees grew twisted at its edges, people whispered it was because the soil had been poisoned by ritual. When fires refused to burn near the old altar, some said it was because the ground no longer belonged to the living. For decades, children were warned never to wander too far east of the river, lest they be taken by the same force that had claimed their ancestors. The leader's fate became its own legend. Some believed he had fled west, changing his name and starting again among new settlers. Others swore they saw him walking the roads at night, unchanged, his face pale and his eyes unblinking, as though he truly had conquered time. A handful of accounts, written in shaky handwriting, claimed encounters with a stranger who never seemed to age. Whether these were hoaxes, hallucinations, or something else, they added fuel to the fire of speculation. The promise of immortality lingered not as fact, but as an unsettling possibility. Generations later, the story of the cult still surfaced in odd places. Local folklore preserved it in ghost stories told around hearths. Amateur historians sought the site of the altar, often returning with strange photographs or objects they swore were relics. Skeptics dismissed these as accidents or fabrications, but even skeptics lowered their voices when speaking of the cult. It was as though everyone, believer or not, sensed that some part of the story had never been fully told. The epilogue of such a tale does not end with answers. It ends with shadows, with silences that refuse to be filled. Perhaps the cult was nothing more than the tragic convergence of suffering, loneliness, and the desperate need for hope. Perhaps the leader was only a man, gifted with words but broken in spirit, who led others to ruin out of his own delusions. Or perhaps, just perhaps, he touched something beyond understanding, something that answered when he called. Something that promised eternity but demanded a price no human soul should ever give. To walk the fields where the settlement once stood is to feel that question pressing in the air. The prairie has long since reclaimed the cabins, the fires, the stone. Grass bends in the wind and silence drapes the land. But sometimes in the stillness, there are those who claim to hear faint chanting carried on the breeze. Sometimes, in the shimmer of moonlight, shadows appear to gather where no one stands. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of night, a figure is said to move slowly among the trees, watching, waiting, as though he never left. The story of the cult in 1847 is not simply history. It is a reflection of human longing, the longing to escape death, to hold on to loved ones, to find certainty where none exists. It is a reminder that hope, when twisted by desperation, can become as dangerous as despair. And it is a warning whispered from one generation to the next that immortality is not a gift, but a temptation. To reach for it is to risk everything, and to lose far more than life itself. Perhaps that is why the tale endures, why it refuses to die as surely as the people who sought to cheat death itself. For in the silence of Illinois nights, under the endless sky, the question still lingers. Did they fail, or did they succeed? Were they consumed by madness, or did they step into something beyond the reach of the living? No one can say. The only truth that remains is the mystery and the unease that comes with knowing that some doors once opened never fully close.